Hey everybody, welcome back to Teens No Cap. I'm your host, Charity Chafee. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Massachusetts, and I specialize in working with teenagers. They're my entire practice, particularly high-risk teenagers. And you are listening to Teens No Cap, which is all about teens in treatment and how we as therapists can support them and how we can support parents who are parenting teenagers, because we know that it's very hard. So I am coming to you today actually from Pennsylvania. You can see my background is different. I have been at a conference today, and there's another day, day 2 of the conference tomorrow that I'm very excited about. But I still needed to record my podcast. So you're joining me here. I look a mess because it's been a long day. I'm very tired, but I needed to record this. And I figured because it's a teen podcast and it's a teen conference, that I could read to you some of my bullet point notes from the trainings today and just share with you some nuggets of information that I wrote down and some thoughts I had, and I can go back and kind of read them. But I wanted to give you no context so that I could understand what comes up for you when you hear these things written down. So we got to watch a lot of really great presenters today. And for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm at the Teen Therapy Conference in Pennsylvania, run by Katie Keats-May. I will tag her below in this as well. And I'm going to tag all the presenters that we're talking about this today and all of their social media links, because I do think that they had so many really great things to say. And I'm really jazzed about what tomorrow is going to bring and who I get to see. So I made a list. I love to take notes during conferences. And all of us work with teens. We specialize in teen treatment, and these conferences don't really exist in a way that they probably should, especially because a lot of people like to say that teenagers are just little adults or we block them in with children. But teens deserve their own very special category, and they are not like any other developmental framework. And so I'm really excited that a conference like this exists, and I can't wait to see more of them come up in the future, because I do think that it is a specialty and it would be really cool to see that this happens more than it does right now. But you're also on my phone today in case you're watching this video, and I know it's a little awkward because I was trying to find the right stuff and then my computer wouldn't start, so bear with me for today. But I'm going to read you my notes from all these, and I'll tag everybody below. And I really think, if there's something that connected with you and something you're really curious about, please like and follow the folks that did the training today, subscribe to their stuff, purchase their trainings. I think that they had so many really valid things to say, and a lot of them have offers outside of one-to-one therapy, which I think is great. So without further ado, we will jump in. So these are just notes I took. And again, I'm not going to give you any context for what they were about. I will go back and we'll talk about some of them, but it is late and I don't want to keep myself up forever. So bear with me. All right. Starting out hot out of the gate. Regulation isn't always calm. Safety is the treatment. You yelled at me equals the reaction is conveying fear. Trauma is what happens in the nervous system. It's not about the incident. Behaviors don't come from nowhere. Resistance is a form of autonomy. Is it your agenda or is it the kid's need? Before you can get regulation within someone, you have to have regulation with someone. Oh, these are so good, guys. Language of sports and athletes isn't just vocab, it's identity. Meeting athletes where the culture is instead of where they're at. Maladaptive versus adaptive perfectionism. 90% of athletes identify their coach as their biggest role model. Huge. Coaches act as an attachment figure for student athletes. Emotion suppression is normalized in sports. Collaborate with more coaches on the mental health needs of their students. Asking questions like, what did you learn from your mistake? I wrote myself a little note here that said building capacity and flexibility. It seemed to be one of the themes today in discussing kind of everything that came up. And really, when we're talking about collaboration, we're talking about building the collaborative web, because everyone kind of has a hand in it. One of our biggest jobs as teen therapists is to manage parental emotions, but you must be brave. Policies are the structure for practice, so kind of standing on business. Practice policies are different than consents for treatment. Being risk averse becomes a barrier for competent care. When working towards girls feeling safe in environments, we have to make sure their voice is there. Adultification bias. The goal is not willpower, it's environmental design and behavior. Mhm. Shame and secrecy function as supportive behaviors. Shame is a relational wound. Map the need, not the behavior. And I love this part. Your best practice, the way you build and market your practice and run your groups and all those things, is not going to be like anybody else does because they act as very different things. And some people are using them as funnels, some people are using their practice as a space for other things. You have to build your practice, you have to build your content, your whatever, based around what you want, what your purpose of that is, um, not based on what someone else tells you. So I want to pause for a second because I think as someone who exclusively works with teenagers, I have seen something very interesting happen in the field. And for me, what that was that as I got more experience working with parents and teenagers, and as I got more complex cases and I got more high risk referrals and other things like that, I noticed that the intensity of training and the things I had access to that were truly supportive for my work with teenagers was lacking. And I have for a long time said that if you are treating teens, you should be trained in teen, even if you only have one teen on your caseload. And I am a firm believer that if you are accepting someone and you're treating them on your caseload, that you should have intimate knowledge of how to work with that age group, the demographic, the situation, the diagnosis, whatever. And I know everyone starts somewhere, so I'm not trying to like throw shade at anybody who's like new and developing skills. I get it, we all start somewhere. But what has been really frustrating for me is that there really haven't been a lot of high quality trainings that really focus just on teens. And what we would see a lot of is we'd see people that were offering trainings in child and teen or teen and adult. But the problem with that is that teens are not children and they don't want to be treated as children, and they're experiencing different developmental growth and phases and orientation, and they're also not yet adults and do not have the freedom and autonomy of most people over the age of 18. So the problem really became is that a lot of the trainings weren't really focused on teenagers. They kind of lumped them in as like a side component or as just like a weird addition. And so being at Teen Focus Conference is really cool because we're literally just talking about teenagers. And so we're focused very specifically on what's happening for them in these different areas and how we can be more supportive and how things are coming across and what the numbers are, what the data says, how we can be collaborative partners with parents and with schools and coaches and things like that. And so it's really cool to hear what other people who work with teenagers are doing in their practices and how their lens and their perspective is helping to kind of like support and encourage this. And the thing that kind of really came up for me in this conference is that we all have such good information. When you've worked with teens long enough, you have such good information, such good, knowledge, such good, name the thing. But we all have a little bit of a different approach, right? We use ourselves in different ways. In those processes, which I think is really cool. So the way that I practice, the way that I talk about teens, the way that I interact with teens, the way that I treat teens is a little bit different because there is a personality component for me. There is an experiential component for me. There is a lived experience component for me. And so we're all kind of coming from different lenses and different spaces. And it has been so cool to hear about how other people see or conceptualize or what the perspective is or how they kind of conceptualize treatment that they're doing. So it's been real fun. I'm very excited for day 2. But I want to take a moment and just kind of go back through some of the bigger bullets that I had written down because I think these are really classic and they're actually very applicable, whether you work with one teen or 50 teens. So, one of our presenters today, which I thought was super cool, had talked about how regulation isn't always calm. And that actually triggered this idea for me because when I go back and I think about my time working in residential, my time working in group care, that could not be more true, right? I would have kids that needed to be regulated in certain ways. Some kids needed to be down-regulated. Some kids needed to be up-regulated. Some kids really needed you to join with them in the anger, the rage, the frustration, the whatever. And so when we talked about kind of like TCI or crisis intervention models, so much of that was actually based on how do we figure out regulation for teenagers? How do we figure out where to meet them and what they really need? And the people that were really good at TCI were actually really good at regulating, right? Both themselves and the client. And they knew them so well that there was never a guess on what would work. It's just, I know this kid and we have to offer this, and this is what we do, and this is the process, and this is the thing. And it got there. And I think she made such a great point about how regulation doesn't always look calm. It can't always look calm. I think people have this idea that when we're regulating, we are calm and we are breathing and we are, whatever. But she made such a valid point, and I think we talk about this a lot, is that in order to get the brain online, the body has to feel safe, right? So if we are trying to talk to the brain while the body feels unsafe, regulation isn't going to happen. But if we can help regulate the body in whatever way that makes sense, and then we can regulate the brain and kind of get them back online, it's going to be easier to figure out what's happening and what's going on and what they need. So regulation isn't always calm, and that's really cool. One thing that I talk a lot about, at least in the beginning, was rapport with clients. And I think what's really interesting is I think there is a difference between rapport and having a good relationship and a client feeling safe in treatment. And I think that having a good rapport sometimes for new clinicians means that they're not going to rock the boat. They're not going to give the feedback. They're not going to say the thing. They're going to withhold something maybe. And I think safety is being able to be really upfront, honest, respectful, knowing that like you're always going to kind of give the feedback that would be helpful. And I do think that feeling safe in treatment is very different from feeling like you have a good rapport. Sure, they can go off of each other, and I know that they are like connected, but when this speaker talked about safety is the treatment, I was like, that is so fair. And that is something that I really aim for in all my sessions with my teenagers, is like, if they're not feeling safe in treatment, it doesn't matter what kind of rapport we have, right? It doesn't matter, because I'm not going to be able to give feedback. I'm not going to be able to regulate their body. I'm not going to be able to help them regulate with me. Then it's just like not going to work. So I think sometimes people conflate safety and rapport, but I think they're two very different things. I'd be curious about your thoughts on that. So drop them below. The other one I really liked is when we talked about trauma is what happens in the nervous system. And I love the way she framed that, because I do think that we often indicate trauma in terms of like an experience they had, or the car accident, the house burning down, the assault, the whatever. But really, I think it may potentially make people feel like they are so out of control and that there's like nothing they can do to kind of like work through their own trauma because they can't change the event that happened, right? And so the way that I took this is that if we're talking about trauma that's happening in the nervous system, right? If we're talking about trauma that happens in the nervous system, then there are active things that we can do to regulate that and to help change that response, so that doesn't have to be something that happens every time, that gets ingrained, that gets like really cemented in our systems. And I actually think, and again, I'm curious, drop your thoughts below. I think that talking about trauma happening in the nervous system might actually help people feel like they do have more autonomy, they do have more control, and it might mean that they're more active, more engaged in treatment, because it's something that they feel like they can control and they can shift. So the other thing that had come up, and I had said this, is the resistance as autonomy. And I think that there are a lot of providers, particularly teen providers, maybe child providers, who really struggle with the whole idea of resistance. And they feel like if someone's resistant, then they're this, they're that, they're, you know, don't want treatment, etc. But resistance is really just a data point. It's really just information. And then I think when you're talking teenager, there's actually a very powerful reason that teens offer resistance because it's part of building autonomy, right? So if you have, a teenager or teenager and you're saying like, go clean your room, and they say, no, I'm not going to go do that, what they're doing, yes, they're saying no at the upfront value, but what they're really doing is they're practicing autonomy, right? They may really want autonomy for those pieces. And so I think like instead of viewing resistance in a negative way, we can view it really as a growth skill and as a developmental milestone. And then we can play with that both as therapists and parents in terms of how do we function with resistance? How do we work with that? What is that telling us about where that teen is at? And I don't think resistance needs to be a bad thing. I also I loved all of these things, which is why I wrote them down. But I think that there are a few things that definitely people like hit the nail on the head. And one of those is they were talking about how when you go into a session and you have an expectation and you have an agenda, especially with a teenager, there's going to be some natural resistance there because you're not actively meeting them where they're at. And it's not really about what they need in the moment. It's about what you want out of them or what you need in the moment. And that's not teen focused treatment. So I think when you're going to have a meeting with a client or you're trying to address something that mom and dad are concerned about, or parents or school, we really need to sit back and consider if that is an agenda driven thing or if that is something that could actively benefit the client. And I appreciate the framework for that because I think a lot of people get stuck in trying to be like, oh, I have to be like the mouthpiece for the parents, or I have to like, address this. And I just want you to stop and question that. Do you have to, or do you just feel pressured to? Because those are different things. So when we talk about regulation with someone before regulation within someone, it follows this, I guess, concept, right? That I was always taught when we're talking like TCI and crisis intervention in residential, is that when you're trying to regulate a client, you are literally letting them borrow your nervous system. You are letting them like kind of like barnacle on they're borrowing your nervous system. And whether you see it or not in the moment, what that actually is doing is we're literally showing them the path and we're helping scaffold and build the skills for what they'll need to be able to do that work for themselves. And so it is a lot about role modeling. It's a lot about showing before we can expect them to do that themselves. The next presentation, which was so cool, and I learned so much, the presenter was talking about student athletes and about how kind of working with athletes is a very interesting kind of like niche population with a lot of different intersectionalities. And it was really cool to talk about how all those things present and how people typically perceive them. Um, and so, like, I think I've long known when I'm talking to someone who's a student athlete that oftentimes, like, sports are their identity because it's the thing they're involved in. And when we think about how parents talk about teenagers, when someone asks, like, oh, how is so and so doing? It's like, oh, they joined the lacrosse team, they're a lacrosse player, like, they scored goals, whatever. Like, talk about your accomplishments. That very easily can switch into becoming that, like, long term identity. So I just thought that was a really cool piece and a good example. Um, the other thing that I thought was really interesting, and now I've worked with a lot of student athletes, I've worked with a lot of folks with high performance, I've worked with, people who have been like on track for Olympics, whatever, as teenagers. And I didn't have the stat on this, but I think it's really fascinating that 90% of athletes identify their coach as the biggest role model. 90%, right? And I think about that, and I think about the breakdown of the clients that I've had that have had healthy athlete coach relationships, and it's actually a very small portion. A very small portion of my clients have had healthy relationships with their coach. And then you think about the fact that if that's my experience, that's probably something we could, be curious about data wise, which means that there are a lot of people that are their biggest role model, they actually have an unhealthy, imbalanced relationship with. So think about that. That's very interesting. She had also mentioned emotion suppression is normalized within sports. And I think the interesting part about that is that there are a lot of things that are glorified as part of sport culture, as part of whatever, that tend to create then the barriers for mental health. And she said this today in training, and I was like, that's so interesting because they're both praised for the things that they do and then feel a lot of shame because they can't just push the pain. They can't just make it go away. They can't. So she's one to definitely like track and follow. And I think she's super cool for bringing that up and bringing it as part of the conversation. I do think that there's a lot of people that don't necessarily understand how to work with student athletes in such like a niche way. But it was a really cool presentation to kind of sit and listen to. The other thing I had written down is like, what did you learn from your mistake? And what's really interesting is that I think that mistakes, somatic experiences, any sort of experience is really just data and information. And that if we allow the things that are in our lives to be learning experiences and learning opportunities, we're going to get more out of it. And so I think that it was kind of cool to see her extend that into talking about student athletes and, making poor plays, bad decisions, whatever on the field they felt like they could have done better. But I think there's this kind of constant evolution around like, if we're not having the conversation about what did you learn from this mistake, we're not really understanding the human experience because all of us make mistakes. No one is perfect. But at the end of the day, if we're unwilling to learn from those mistakes, or there's a barrier there to learning from those mistakes, it's going to be a lot harder for us to kind of like level up in the way that we'd want to. The other thing that kind of came up a lot, which I thought was really cool, was a lot of like collaboration. And I've talked about that before because I do think that we sometimes don't interact and engage with systems of support enough. And we don't talk to parents enough. We don't talk to coaches enough. We don't talk to school enough. And I think collaboration is a really important piece because even if you don't necessarily see that client all the time, you might see them like once a month, you're still part of the puzzle, right? And I think the more supportive and like networked and like connected all of those like providers are that are working with a teenager, the better that team is going to be, the more well functioning it's going to be, and hopefully the better outcomes we're going to get for that teenager. Just like teens don't live in a vacuum and we should be including parents in care, that family also is not in a vacuum, and there are lots of other factors and features that are impacting them. And I think we could probably, as a community of people who work with teens, do a better job at collaboration and really understanding our stake in it. The other piece that was super cool is Angie today. Again, I'll link all of her stuff below because she was super fun to watch. And by the way, Angie, you are super funny, and I just want to put that on recording for you because I know that there's a disagreement at home about whether or not you're funny, and I think you're hilarious. So I'm going to record this for you and put it in so that way you have proof that I'm saying this, that you're funny. So anyway, one of the presentations, and Angie was talking about kind of like high conflict divorce situations and kind of how to support the teenager during that. And the one thing that I just really loved about her presentation was the fact that she talked about how, if we are so risk averse that it's causing barriers to competent treatment, we're not actually helping anyone. And so one thing I love that she said is just to be brave, to cross your T's, dot your I's, to understand what you're getting into. But at the same time, there are so many things that she talked about today in her presentation that we already do as therapists. I just think in a different way when people kind of like bring the law into it, they bring legal issues. It feels so much more complicated, so much riskier. But it's not something we have to be scared of. Just the same way, like I'm not scared of working with high risk teens, but I know there are a lot of people that are, and they're more risk averse. But we have to understand what that is for ourselves as therapists, what risk we can tolerate, and then making sure we have all the information so that we can make the best decision possible. So for those of you who are contemplating working with like high risk families or, high conflict divorce stuff, Angie is super cool, great resource. Talks a lot about it. I think would be like a really fantastic like consultant if you like needed help and support with it. But it was super cool. And actually in that conversation too, it seemed like there were a lot of maybe confusion around what a policy was and what a consent for treatment was. And I guess when I think about policies, I always think about how policies are basically like our boundaries on paper, right? These are our expectations of treatment, engagement, fees, financial payment, etc. And consent is really just like, are you agreeing to accept treatment? Are you, it's a little bit different. And so if you're curious about policies, I am going to do a whole bunch of other stuff in May and June around policy practice. I am still in the middle of building my entire intake packet. Hopefully we'll be out soon in 2026. So that way you have all the policies that I use, all the consent, everything wrapped in that's entirely teen focused. So I'm very excited about that. But the other thing, there was someone that had presented on body focused repetitive behavior. And I think one of the biggest points was just talking about how like that's not actually self-harm. We should still assess for self-harm, but it's not actually self-harm. And it was kind of interesting to hear it from that lens, because I know in the past I've kind of had questions about, when does some of the body focused behavior become self-injury? And I think that is part of the nuance of being able to assess those things, is like, is this more of a body focused repetitive behavior, or is this more of just like a self-injury piece? But it was a super cool presentation to have, and I know there are not a lot of therapists that specialize in that. I'm hoping more people like might do. I'd love to get more training in it, but I think it's a really cool kind of like smaller niche, and I think it's really necessary. So, and anyway, she talked a lot about, shame and secrecy. And, I think when I think about like parenting teenagers, if teens feel shameful, their behaviors are going to become secret. And then we no longer have the privilege or the access to those thoughts, feelings, emotions, behaviors, etc. And so I think that part of the challenge I would have, that I would give to parents, is to really try to understand and analyze their response to their teens like negative choice or bad behavior, or even just like struggle behavior, coping skill, whatever. Because if our responses as therapists or parents are increasing that level of shame, we are almost guaranteeing that behavior is going to become more secretive, and they're not going to be willing to help or to receive help or to be open to that, because they're going to feel too much shame. I really appreciate how shame and grief came up a lot in the conference today. And I think that that's something that we don't talk enough about. We don't talk enough about shame and grief and guilt. And those are some really heavy emotions that oftentimes people don't even have the label for. But I do appreciate that we named them today, and we had discussion and conversation around what those things are. So those are all my bullets for today. Um, like I said, today was day one. I'm very excited about tomorrow. There's lots of good people that are presenting. I might do a part 2 of this, because I had a lot of fun just being like, here's a nugget of truth. But like I said, I'm going to link everyone below. There are some people that have books out, that have workbooks out. And I do think that part of my mission in Teens Uncharted is to really help elevate other voices and to support this kind of like shared mission of like, the better good, the greater good for all of the teenagers and all the therapists who see teens. So I am going to wrap up because I'm tired and it is bedtime. But stay tuned for part 2, probably next week as I get this loaded. But again, I'll drop everyone below. I'm super grateful I got to witness all the presentations today. Very excited to hear about day 2. But until next Friday, have a good week.